Welcome to yet another episode of the NewSpace India podcast. Today we have Govind and Ramesh with me here, who have been in the satellite communication sector for almost 30 years. And here we are today talking about the commercial SATCOM industry and the landscape and its emergence in India over the last 3 decades. To begin with, let us talk about what exactly is commercial SATCOM and how it can be defined in the Indian context. So, Govind, if you can begin.
Thanks, NP. Yes, it's always a pleasure talking to you and appreciate your initiative that you have been taking in some of these kind of activities. The commercial SATCOM, as you know, it started probably in India in early 90s. That all depends upon the availability of the resources. That means the satellite capacity that are needed to provide commercial satellite communications, and the various applications also that need to be considered for such things. So in early 90s, government also allowed the use of C-band capacity of ISRO. Of course, ISRO had extended C-band, as they call, for the use of SATCOM applications, mainly VSAT, and allowed the private enterprises to apply for the license to provide such services. And it really began very well in India because there was no competition. So whatever was the cost that was provided by ISRO and the applications that needed for such communications, the available resources they used, and it probably took off very well. Since fiber was also not available in the country at that time, they found the satellite communication for commercial applications very useful.
So, Ramesh, let's talk about, the time when the SATCOM began. Of course, there was no internet at that particular time. And, the liberalization of the Indian economy was still, at the very early phases. So therefore, one can say that the economy was still in times of, shaping up the economy, going through the whole privatization of many sectors and so on. Can you talk a little bit about the demand side on, how the ecosystem was during this pre-internet era and these SATCOM things started to kick off?
Yeah, excellent. Actually, right. I'm taking cue from where Govind mentioned about the commercialization of the SATCOM industry in India. I think one way to define it would be that which part of the whole business chain do you get a private enterprise to get involved? All along, ISRO, in its initial phase, ISRO, maybe as ISRO or in the avatar of Department of Space, was always holding all ends of the business chain. But somewhere along, maybe as the demand started growing in early 90s, there was some role by the private enterprise. They opened up the private enterprise to play some role in the entire chain of the business. That is probably one way to define the role of or define what is commercial SATCOM in India. One nice way that we can probably look at the various stages of the entire SATCOM business from 90s down to 2020 would be put them in 4 different categories. One would be the pre-internet era, the era that was there before the government opened up the internet service policy and allowed for private operators to play. That's the pre-internet era. And then the boom period where internet started playing a very predominant role in entire Indian business cycle. That also opened up SATCOM market for India. There was a lot of buzz and noise about internet service provider using satellite as the gateway to connect. That was, as Govind mentioned, was also the period where fiber was still not there, or if it was there, it was not in its best form as we know it today. And there was a free run period. I guess the SATCOM guys in India had a free run for at least 4 or 5 years, early 2000 onwards. Slowly, the fiber started coming in, and the enterprise started complaining about latency, an issue that didn't really exist then, and fiber providing better latency. The internet service providers slowly switched out from SATCOM or satellite as a connect to the internet cloud to fiber. But then there's a lot of resilience in the SATCOM industry as such. What closed one door opened up another door of opportunity. 2002, 2003 onwards, you have a plethora of broadcasters coming in. Even today, I'm told that there are about 200, 300 applications for new satellite services, new satellite television channels to come in. And maybe I could get corrected on this fact, but then every broadcaster had to have his channel on the satellite. So that opened up new opportunities, huge opportunities that ISRO itself could not serve, and opened up for other Asian satellite operators to come in. Now we see satellite dying. Now we see satellite television dying. No, linear television is now on its way out, with Netflix, Amazon, all addressing non-linear requirements. And the best part of the business is that while broadcast as a market for satellite is moving out, new markets are coming in. We're talking about India having a huge initiative for Bharat broadband or Digital India and smart cities. So, nice, interesting story about India in its commercial form, starting from pre-internet down to smart cities. That's where I think Narayan things look here.
So Govind, let us talk about the early phases of the 90s. You talked about C-band and the opening up of those services. Of course, ISRO has always been playing the role of providing the capacity over the Indian geography. But tell us a little bit about what were the kind of services that were provided initially, and who are the kind of players and equipment manufacturers and end users.
Same. As Ramesh mentioned, of course, satellite communication applications varies from VSAT to broadcasting. So in the early 90s, as you mentioned, mainly ISRO provided C-band capacity for, as we call, VSAT applications. VSAT applications could be many things. One of the primary things is to connect the ATMs. So banks also, in fact, they started what is known as RBI Net. So they wanted to connect all the bank through the VSAT terminals to provide the seamless connectivity for the banking customers. So that was one of the major applications where many private VSAT operators started providing services. Apart from that, one of the major applications, as I could see, is teleeducation and telemedicine. Both were the initiatives of ISRO, and obviously ISRO also encouraged private enterprises to provide such services. So though of course it did not take off the way it was anticipated by the original thinkers of both applications, but still I consider that as one of the major steps, teleeducation and telemedicine using VSATs. And there are so many other applications also, because VSAT, which uses satellite, the technology has got its own strength and limitations, no doubt. Always we have to use the medium, making use of that strength. So satellite has got strength of providing point to multi-point and broadcast applications. So we have to use satellite for such applications where we don't consider fiber as a competitor. Fiber is another medium, and this. So because of that, so lot of applications where you needed point to multi-point and broadcasting applications, VSAT and SATCOM were used.
Ramesh, so Govind talked about VSAT applications and banking and so on. How was the penetration, or what created the demand for it? Was it pure policy that RBI laid down or the government laid down that created the demand, or was the demand coming from the people themselves saying, okay, we need to have more ATMs in more different places, and therefore banks took the initiative in doing this?
Yeah, a good question. Primarily, I think what you call as the tipping point. The tipping point happened when the private enterprise or the large public sectors realized that as they were expanding either their manufacturing facilities in different parts of India or looking for natural resources into interior India, they realized that their connectivity was a big problem. How do you connect when there is only one provider and the provider is slow? If you look at it, there wasn't even BSNL as we know today. We only know it as devotee. So that was the only way that you could get connected, and devotee laying of copper at that time was a big challenge, and they were not really getting into deep interior India, confining themselves to a few metros in the country. That triggered the need for VSAT as a mode of connect. Thankfully, at that time, ISRO was playing a very positive role, and they saw this need being reasonably well addressed through their satellites, which were there using, as Govind said, the extended C-band. The choice of an extended C-band is something else that we could probably leave it for another day of discussion, because they could have stayed with standard C-band, reduced hardware cost, but that's another story to tell. While that drove the market, I believe one other tipping point story would be the share market, the National Stock Exchange and the Bombay Stock Exchange. All of these started seeing a huge transaction happening. I guess this is the early 90s or the mid 90s. There was the stock boom happening while the whole of the world was going into recession. India was on the rise there. Harshad Mehta and all these things happening at that time. So that drove a need for better connectivity between the various stock exchanges and large stockbrokers. That was another good opportunity that so Govind also mentioned, the stock exchanges connecting using satellite. And digital banking, or banking as we know it today, now mandates that you must have all your branches, wherever they are, connected on one or two modes of communication or connect. So you may have a primary BSNL or a devotee connection, but you still had to have a VSAT link. So these three things drove the Indian market with reasonable anticipatory demand coming up, and we had at least 3 or 4 large private players who were driving the India market, and every year the number of VSAT installations kept growing. We still were confined to data rates which were pretty low. Maybe 2 reasons for that. The technology itself was not able to shape up to provide higher data rates, or the point was that we had a policy which was slightly myopic in vision, that we're not opening up ourselves completely to see that. That changed the moment India opened up to the internet market. Narayan.
So, Govind, you talked about this VSAT again. All of this needs a lot of policy backing at a higher level as to how players will be involved, how the equipment may be licensed, how the frequency may be given out, and all of these things. So, how did the whole policy situation evolve? Because especially you have now 2 government departments, one which is the Department of Space providing the capacity, and because it is also a lot of communication related. Ramesh talked about Department of Telecommunications, DOT, in this process. So, who set the policy and how all of these were happening?
Yeah, that's a good thing. See, whenever you talk about policy, I always say that policy should evolve. So in the beginning, you have to define something and come out with some guidelines for people to comply with. So in India, it has been for satellite, whenever anything related to satellite means it's always Department of Space is the main organization to drive. And for the services, it is the Department of Telecommunications. So that means the licensor is Department of Telecommunications always, who actually officially formulates the policy for the services. The satellite component of that is always governed by Department of Space. So that's a healthy thing, because two departments are involved in this connection, because the satellite, whenever we talk satellite, it's always a highly regulated market, not only in India and globally. So you need to come out with certain policies to for the people to comply with them. So what they did, what anybody will do in the beginning, is to come out with certain policies, allow the private companies to comply with, and as they move on, they come out with a lot of issues, concerns that need to be addressed. That is what I think both DOT and DOS have been addressing, which is a healthy thing. That means it should get evolved and address the concerns of the users mainly, taking into consideration the interest of the government here.
Ramesh, so when these technologies evolve, there's a lot of private sector people involved in the equipment side. There's a lot of training required for these installations. There's a lot of maintenance required. There's a lot of technology on the ground side to develop all the schemes and coding and all the other electronics behind it. Was all of these technologies available with Indian suppliers, or were many of these technologies, they were utilized, there's a foreign component to this as well?
Yeah, unfortunately, we were the laggards when it came to bringing in or the use of VSAT in communication or connect. Most of the other countries, especially even closer neighborhood, most of the ASEAN countries had reasonably well advanced by the time India opened up to more serious consideration of what technology to use and how do we stay connected. So we began with a bit of a handicap that we had to adapt ourselves to what was there in the market. But then for some strange reason, I continue to say that we chose to be on a slightly different band, the extended C band. Maybe because that's where the satellites were designed, or that's I don't know the broader intent behind that thing. That resulted, according to me, I'm sure there's another viewpoint to this argument, is that resulted in the big international hardware manufacturers having to tweak their equipment to suit up to this band, which meant that the demand for this particular band only came from India, and that drove the prices. And if the equipment prices went up, finally the service prices went up. And so we could have probably done better. We could have maybe had a wider market. Our VSATs could have been more populated or all over had we chosen to be agnostic to the band or the hardware, which unfortunately we didn't do that. That said, India has been able to do pretty well now. Now India is a big market. We are able to open up to lots of services, especially if you move the discussion from typical VSAT to obviously the second big opportunity that is there for SATCOM, which is broadcast. India has done very well on the broadcast sector, and we are a large user of these kind of services and hardware. So from what started off as a handicap, now Indian broadcasting market drives the worldwide need as such. That's what I would summarize.
So Govind, can you give us some numbers on what is the VSAT penetration at its peak in India during the rise and down?
Numbers are, Govind, maybe my thoughts on this is that numbers are very hard to comment about. The reason being is that these numbers are they're not growing rapidly. They're not growing very rapidly. You don't have one single user who will say, I have 100,000 VSATs deployed or VSAT terminals deployed. There is no such one user who could do that. For multiple reasons, some of them being policy driven, and second is there's a lot of overheads that come up for every VSAT terminal that's deployed. There is a certain amount of cost element that you need to pay to the regulator in terms of the annual charges that come up. So if these are more streamlined, we might have a better number to talk about. But
actually, when it comes to numbers, it's all in public domain. In fact, if you go to devotee websites, it mentions the number of VSATs that are in operation, and based upon the numbers that are provided by the VSAT service providers. As Ramesh mentioned, the license fee, when the policy was originally implemented, there was a fixed license fee payable by each licensee. Subsequently, based upon, as I mentioned in the beginning, that based upon the concerns and the feedback the government received, they also changed the licensing conditions. So what they made was, instead of having a fixed license fee, based upon the number of VSATs they deploy and also based upon the revenue that they generate, a certain percentage of that revenue was given to government as a license fee, which is a healthy thing. So in order to make that happen, government also asked the VSAT service providers to give the numbers of the VSATs that are deployed, based on which, of course, the license fee can be complete. So there are two large users, as we mentioned. One is the bank net, another is the stock exchange, because country-wise they deployed thousands of terminals. So as we evolved, since we spoke only about extended C-band, the users also demanded KU band. So originally, when they actually designed the policy, it was only C-band is what they had mentioned. So subsequently, KU band was also allowed to be used by the service providers.
So what is the basic difference between extended C-band and the KU band, and why this demand came up?
See, generally it is believed that the cost of ground equipment for KU band will be cheaper. It's more cost effective than C-band. Mainly the size of the antenna that determines. See, in extended C-band, the size of the antenna will be large. It becomes difficult to implement that in crowded places. So the size of the antenna in KU band comes down drastically, which is easy for them to implement. And also, as Ramesh also mentioned, because of the extended C-band being used in India, the cost of equipment also was high. When it comes to KU band, India also adopted the standard KU band to be used by VSAT operators. The equipment cost is same for India and other countries. So the cost of equipment also came down drastically. The size and the cost helped KU band to penetrate more.
Who are the major VSAT players commercially in India now?
Well, there are quite a few of them. Before we get there, there's something that I thought I'll just recall was on the way the Indian government designed the policies around this. There's one interesting story that comes up to my mind is that I know of a company which applied for paging license for all over India. I think there were 21 or 22 circles at that time, and this company got the license for all 22 circles. They bid for all 22 circles, hoping that they could use a VSAT network and network all the 22 circles to a single centralized hub and manage their hardware cost and run the operations more efficiently. Only to be later on told that the policy doesn't allow for the VSAT services to work across the different circles, or whatever that meant. I mean, if you were awarded the license to operate your paging services in Circle A, you couldn't club that or run that along with Circle B, which then meant that this poor paging operator who had 22 circles to work had to set up 22 networks. So sometimes you see, these are things that kind of shook the market and made people think twice before investing into a technology which the policy framework was not very nicely drafted out. So that was something that I was saying. I know what you were talking about, the players. There are at least predominantly 3 or 4 large players there. There were a couple of public sector. There were at least 2 public sector operators who chose to be VSAT operators. 2 large private enterprise came up there. I can't name them out today because there's been a shake-up in the market. Couple of them have folded within each other, and today we have probably 2 large players driving the market, and I'm sure they have their own story to tell you as to why they're not going that fast and what's holding them back. But this industry has slowed down. I can tell you that this industry has slowed down. Despite the golden pot at the end of the horizon, which talks about All India Connect, Digital India, somewhere along, I think SATCOM is going a little slower than the rest of the Connect technologies which are going on.
So VSAT is primarily a slow data kind of connectivity, and also no audio in that sense, right? And the immediate evolution is from VSAT being slow data to a more video format along with audio, right, commercially. So in that sense, I guess the logical transition of technology or services from VSAT to broadcasting. So with that, what is the demand side of broadcasting that was, in India early 90s, and how did it evolve? Because I still remember we were all watching television on cable, and cable was also limited to very urban centers. So what created the demand for broadcasting?
Correct. There are 2 things. See, there is always need for broadcasting applications, because people are always eager to see the television content on the television. So it all depends upon various things: availability of content, availability of capacity, and also the licensing conditions to move forward. See, broadcasting, of course, also as I mentioned, is evolved. First, India started with Doordarshan. As you mentioned, you were all used to seeing the Doordarshan television channel, probably via cable or terrestrial link, which we still recollect, and it's good. But looking at the demand in India, the foreign broadcast channels started providing services over India, and a lot of Indian companies, Indian broadcasters also started their broadcasting services. As we are talking, I think there are about 150 plus news channels and totally about 800 television channels operating in India by various private broadcasters. So for this, obviously we need capacity. ISRO provides capacity to some extent, and ISRO facilitates the broadcasters to contract with the foreign satellite operators to meet their requirement, both C-band for normal broadcasting applications and KU-band for the direct-to-home pay TV television applications. So, all in all, the broadcast industry, of course, each industry, as we mentioned, VSAT industry, they started over a period of time, they see ups and downs for various reasons. In the same way, broadcast industry also started very well, and as they move forward, because other technologies, they come in, it becomes difficult for them to compete with them, so they always see ups and downs. By and large, of course, broadcast industry itself is doing well, but they also try to adopt the new available technologies like OTT and things like that. But still, there is a demand for satellite capacity for this industry.
So, Ramesh, what is the timeline between like VSAT and broadcasting taking off? And was it around the same time that both VSAT and broadcasting took off? Or?
Broadcasting is more like a post-2000 story. Broadcasting, I think the Gulf War triggered a few additional channels to come into India, and at that time, STAR, as it was, the acronym for STAR stood for Satellite Television Asia Region. That is what we recall it being called as. STAR was there, and that then opened up for private enterprise to come in, and we had Z being one of the big initial broadcasters to come in. But then I may have a different story to tell you on this. As Govind mentioned, 800 television channels, 115 news channels. That's probably the sum total of all the other television channels in all over Asia, which then should have made us the Asian hub for broadcasting. But we are not. We are not the Asian hub for broadcasting. A large number of television channels choose to broadcast out of Singapore, choose to broadcast out of Hong Kong. That's very sad. That's because none of us, or not us of course, none of the governments which came into power visualized that we could have been a big broadcast hub. There is a small country tucked in the Middle East that's known as Israel, and it is one of the largest broadcast hub for Asian services. It connects Asia to the Western world, and there are at least 30, 40, 50 channels that are uplinked out of Tel Aviv or in the neighborhood of Tel Aviv on Indian satellites, on INSAT satellites, and probably another 50, 60 on satellites which beam on India. I guess we missed that big opportunity of being. There was a talk about India having missed out the big opportunity being the aircraft or the airline hub for Asia. We have an airport in Calcutta which is twice or thrice the size of what the need is. Similarly, we could have been truly an Asian broadcast center. We missed that thing. But who's the largest user? India has about 800 television channels, and maybe there are 300 other channels in all over Asia. But that said, the broadcast market is also beginning to die out now. I think that's a story that needs to be told. We no longer watch television the way we have known to have watched it. We watch non-linear television. So maybe there's another market that is coming up for satellite services. That's something that we can discuss as we have the conversation.
So Govind, you talked about the different channels and everything. So I would assume that having so many channels, some of these people who are delivering content are powerful enough and large enough to probably own a satellite or operate also a satellite by themselves. So I believe Z was one of these channels who wanted to have their own capability of their own satellite and having the end-to-end capability of having both the satellite and the ground bits for their own network, right? So, can you briefly talk to us about that whole evolution of that story?
That's a good question. Yes, the SATCOM policy, which was conceived in the beginning, 1990s, actually provided the private companies to own and operate their own satellite. It looks pretty good. But as we also mentioned, we know that we are discussing satellite, which is highly regulated thing, not in India, everywhere. So obviously you need to come out with norms for private people to comply with. Z, as you clearly mentioned, they wanted to own a satellite, not only to meet their own requirement, of course, to cater to others, and floated a company called Agrani Satellite Communication Company, and applied for the license, and also they got the license actually. So here we cannot find fault with the government, because government actually gave a license to the private company based upon the policy which was in existence there. For various reasons, Agrani could not come out with a satellite and operate their own satellite. So again, things as we move on change rapidly. On this subject, Narayan, we also want to mention that we also came out with a requirement to apply to the government to get the license to operate our own satellite. So we came out with an idea of launching a small satellite, making use of the spectrum that is available, and as a licensee, operate the satellite and provide services to Indian customers. When we talk about satellite operation within the country, one of the main things is to own spectrum. Today, the government policy, obviously, one thing we should know here is, as per the regulation, no individual company can own a spectrum. It's only the country, the state can own the spectrum. So there will be a body, in India of course, WPC is the body equal to FCC to manage that spectrum. So a private company only can apply for a spectrum after getting the license. So that becomes difficult. That means you have to spend a lot of time to get the license, and after getting the license, you need to apply for the spectrum, which will take at least a few years to get that coordinated and make it operational. Maybe we have to, at this juncture, be more flexible. As I mentioned, that everything, of course, we cannot expect any organization, government or otherwise, to come out with a policy that suits everybody. But as we move on, we need to be more flexible to revise and update our policy and clauses within that policy. Maybe my suggestion here would be the government probably can consider giving authorization for the private company to apply for the spectrum license. Of course, it has to be, as I mentioned, that the private company cannot own. It's only the organization like WPC, they can apply. But it's everything the private company can do through that entity and apply for the spectrum. And when that private company gets a license to operate, at least they have the spectrum with them, which can be used. So that will curtail the time required to operate their satellite. Because as we mentioned, the business doesn't wait for the policies. So the policy has to be framed to meet the business requirements, especially when the technology and the requirements of the industry is changing rapidly. So this is one thing I wanted to mention here to your question.
So Govind mentioned about the spectrum and licensing and so on. So one of the other critical aspects of all of this is that you need to have a satellite up in orbit at a given orbital slot for you to provide the service in that region, right? So can you make a quick comparison of how orbital slot allocation, licensing of the spectrum and the ground equipment happens in a different geography, let's say Europe or US, and the relationship between the private operators and the government, and compare that to India? Because I think a lot of this is cluttered in a way, because orbital slots cannot be applied by a private company on its own, as I understand.
Correct.
Spectrum cannot be applied by a private operator on its own because it's the national regulator that has to apply it to the International Telecommunications Union and coordinate. So can you make a very quick comparison of two geographies and explain a bit?
Yeah, see, basically, it's all about how, from where do you start the approach. Like the concept of free trade. You have the famous definition by Alfred Marshall saying that let's allow free trade to happen and the trade will decide how business happens. Even when it comes to the basic opening of the market, India could have, or maybe even now it's not too late, opened up a free trade, not free trade outside the country, but a free trade policy within the country, which would allow for anybody to start their operations. Today, as Govind mentioned, what's delaying growth of the SATCOM industry is not the need. It's not the lack of equipment. It's not the lack of providers. It's not the lack of customers. It's the regulatory process which is slowing it down. Nobody knows today, once you go and make an application with the government, what are the standard timelines through which anything is delivered, or how long does one have to wait for your application to be turned around, maybe turned around not with a go-ahead signal, but turned around with a query, which means that you go through the process again. That is what is holding up the progress of this industry. If you look at if you compare this with the IT sector is not blocked down or not clogged up as much as the SATCOM sector, because there's not much of a regulatory scenario here. So we have ISRO, which is doing some excellent job, which is producing. ISRO also, not directly but indirectly, has a space college, and so there are a lot of space engineers coming out from there. But is there some way that we can have a framework, or what would you call a walled garden, wherein as long as you are within this broad framework, you can do and start working on and start addressing your customers even within the country. So I think if you want the SATCOM industry to grow, there are lots of areas where business can happen. There are smart cities which are coming up. There is backhaul, the need to connect to the truly last mile. That's not happening because at one point, however wired you are on fiber, you have to hop into that true last mile on a wireless mode. This then brings up the challenge of spectrum. This then brings up the challenge of, we've had some not so very pleasant instances of spectrum being talked about in not in the good terms. So if we can go start thinking beyond that bad dream and then open up, I'm sure this industry is set for a real big rise. That's what I would say.
I think that's probably what you were trying to find out is how it happens in other countries. So generally, as we understood that the applications to ITU has to be made by the agencies in a respective country. So in many countries, what happens, the private companies who want to, as I mentioned, want to operate their own satellite will have an understanding and agreement with the state, the country's agency, and the private companies, they will make all the applications and the agency will forward that. So though the agency, obviously the country, wants that filing, wants that spectrum when awarded, but the company, because of that understanding, actually indirectly wants that spectrum. So even in our neighboring countries, in Southeast East Asian countries, there are many private operators who want the spectrum. So it may look contradictory. On one side we say that no, private companies can own the spectrum, which is only the agency, and on the contrary we say that private companies, they own the. What we say that when we say that private companies own the spectrum means they own through an agreement with the agencies, but agency has the actual ownership and rights on the spectrum as far as the ITU is concerned, because the agency is the one who actually does the coordination between various countries. The private companies, as we call them as operators, they also own the spectrum on behalf of the agency, and operator coordination they can do. This is exactly what I was trying to tell, that in India also maybe we could consider the private companies, they come forward, because not many people will come forward. Only those people who are really interested in owning and operating a satellite will come forward. They can probably have an agreement with the agency in India, that is Wireless and Planning Commission, and apply for the spectrum and make a filing. And as I said, it takes few years to get that coordinated. When that happens, and if they have the license, they can operate their own satellite.
Again, on the orbital allocation, especially finding the slots may be very tricky.
Very tricky, yes.
Right? So, there's always a reason, because if India does not have enough slots, always, government will have the priority to use for its own services, for military or other applications. The priority for the country's security or country's needs or government needs, that will take precedence over maybe private operators in certain sense. So, how accessible are these orbital slots to India for the Indian government against our neighbors? Because essentially ITU gives orbital slots to all countries kind of equally, and they can apply to those slots. And does India, firstly, if we don't have orbital slots, there's no supply of positions that India can occupy to provide services. So tell us a little bit about how this orbital slot allocations or a number of slots India has against other neighbors.
See, it all depends upon each country making a filing. So you only get access to the orbital slots based upon the filing you make. And based upon the filing you make, you get the priority over that orbital slot and the spectrum. So each country, they make their own decisions to make filing for number of orbital slots based upon their business and other requirements. India also have made filing, especially of late, more number of filings to ITU for various orbital slots. As I mentioned, since it is especially the spectrum in various orbital slots over Asia is highly crowded with so many operators being there. So again, come back to that. So if there is a serious private satellite operator wanting to get the license operate the satellite, maybe they can have a dialogue with both the Department of Space and the agency to determine which probably orbital slot can be operated over India, and which is earmarked for various strategic applications. Leaving that apart, what can be, so that helps. If there is a healthy dialogue, then it helps the private company to determine which orbital slot and the spectrum they need to go for and make the applications to ITU, so that they can work on getting the necessary coordination done and operate their satellite. So that kind of dialogue should happen. Now we only know that there are spectrum required for various strategic applications. Obviously, as I mentioned, that the satellite is a highly regulated thing, means you need to take the country's interest into account, which is paramount, and within that see what is feasible for the satellite operators to be operated over India. Because if in an Indian company, if it is licensed, obviously you don't need a landing rights, because it's an Indian company. So their spectrum has to be used over India. To make that happen, obviously we need to determine which spectrum can be made available, keeping various factors into account, and operate that orbital slot and spectrum for the satellite operation.
Yeah. So, Ramesh, we talked about VSAT and how DOT plays the licensing role for all of this. I was always curious, to know why the whole satellite, different services did not come under one body to coordinate, to license, to do things. Because from what I understand today, Antrix is playing the role of bridging the demand and supply gap of capacity in India. But if you look at VSAT, for example, the licensing happens through DOT. What is the reason why that the landscape in India changed in this way?
No, it's actually licensing always depends upon the type of services you are going to provide. So DOT is obviously responsible for all telecommunication type of services. So VSAT and similar kind of things come under telecom or communication applications. So DOT is the department which administers the license. Broadcasting come under Information Broadcasting Ministry. So MIB, they govern the license and administer the license to the broadcaster. So any broadcasting related services, that ministry MIB is responsible. For any communication type of services, DOT is responsible. That is fair enough. For both, the common factor is the satellite. Since the satellite is the highly regulated thing, when I say regulated, it involves to see whether it's the capacity of the satellite is properly coordinated with other satellites or not. Who determines that? The Department of Space determines that. So that's the reason, though it looks as though multiple agencies are involved to provide one license or one operations. Actually, if you understand this, not all these agencies are required to be there. Only thing is the proper coordination and the transparency helps the service providers, the private companies to understand better and move forward. Otherwise, it's fine. The Department of Space or ISRO has to be there whenever we talk about the satellite, and DOT and MIB, they only are the departments which provide and administers and monitor the licenses. That's fine. And since you mentioned the Antrix here is the commercial organization of Department of Space. So their role is different from ISRO. So the Antrix actually provides the capacity or the services that are needed by various agencies for providing their services. Like broadcasters approach them for any capacity, VSAT service providers approach them for capacity. Through, of course, the ministry which governs the license. The broadcasters go through MIB for the requirements, VSAT and other service providers go through DOT for getting the
services. The process is much better and smoother now compared to what probably was a couple of years back, 4-5 years back. Now the process is much smoother. That fewer agencies that you have to personally go and interact with to get your licenses. Good amount of streamlining is happening. Excellent amount of streamlining. I see that most of the application is now done online, which means that you don't have to physically go and submit your paper. Things are moving forward. But then again, the point that we need to note is this is not an exciting sector. The sector is not very exciting for the government to go ahead and make some real rapid changes. That will only happen when there's a huge demand. I mean, the sector that everybody's talking about is mobile, 4G, 3G, 5G. Lots of things happening there, and lots of visibility happening on that sector. Unfortunately, we are the players in the background, so we are hardly visible. I mean, the common joke that used to be happening within the industry is that you point to an object that you cannot see at 36,000 kilometers to your customer and then send him the services. So that being the story, this is maybe I'm holding myself back from saying the word, there's kind of a stepmotherly attitude, which is also true because not much is happening in the sector that will generate amount of excitement, as would the mobile market. But all that said, the industry is getting lot streamlined, much better than what it was a few years back. Now, much of your application is deemed cleared if it doesn't get, you don't hear from from the provider or the regulator in certain amount of weeks. And what else is driving the market? The backhaul connectivity for mobile or telcos is another big market that is driving that. And Smart city is also seeing a lot of interest that is being generated for satellite as a connect media. And so that's where we are today as we talk.
I think some of the comparisons between India and US may not be very easy in this sector because US is a very commercial first attitude and approach. Just for academic reasons, let's say we compare India with China because it's more India's state-driven attitude to regulating certain sectors is very similar in that sense to China, especially also that the Chinese state is mostly the driver in the space realm as well. Does the whole process of flying satellites and providing capacity in India and China are similar where private, because I don't know if there are private sector satellite operators in China who provide capacity to Chinese broadcast channels?
No. Answer is no, but I agree that as we discussed that satellite itself is a highly regulated market. It's not for India, but anywhere. So when we say like that, okay, each country can only own the satellite, and also each country is responsible for the operation and otherwise of that satellite because they own that asset legally. So, and each country has to take their country's interest. There is nothing wrong. US obviously takes their country into account and their interest into account. Similarly, China takes their interest into account. India has to take their interest into account. And those interests vary from country to country. US, for example, we say that it's a mostly wired country. This is the largest wired network country. At the same time, US also has got most number of VSAT terminals operating there. What it means is we need not have to worry whether there is a fiber coming in or not. Satellite finds its own market because largely I consider these two are two different medium for providing services. Satellite is a different medium and they find their own applications based upon their technological strength. In the same way, in India also, in spite of so many technologies getting evolved, I'm sure that both will find their own applications and grow, both satellite industry and this. So, in India also has to take their interest into account. That's the reason we have different regulatory bodies in the country to take the country's interest into account. What is required? Again, we are going back to that. We have to have a stronger policy, at the same time flexible approach. So within the policy framework, taking the country's interest into account, I think we need to be more flexible to see how things can happen more quickly in a transparent manner. So,
just adding to what Govind said, if you want to draw a comparison between India and China, both of them have a large captive internal customer base. And China, it's been only over the last few years that China has actually come into the regional space market. Their satellites now look very different from the satellites that were, I'm talking about communication or geo satellites. These newer satellites look very, very different from the satellites that were designed. I'm talking not in terms of technology, but in terms of the contour maps or the coverage that they were. The earlier Chinese satellites were predominantly China-only beams. But look at the new beams that come out look at the bigger beams that come out from China. They have a large hemi beam covering Asia. They have a beam covering over Africa. They now talk about maritime beams. That means that China is behaving truly as a leader. China is looking at a global market. That's what India should be doing it. It's not about orbital slots. Whatever orbital slots you have, India has some of the finest orbital slots. If you look at 74 or you look at around the 90s, excellent orbital slots to have. We should start playing the leadership role. We should have beams which are covering Africa. We should have beams that are covering Afghanistan. These are the new markets that are opening up. That's what we should probably be looking at. And who do we think as competitors in India? A small nation called Singapore. I mean, they provide services into India. You have Malaysia providing services into India. You have Thailand providing services into India. On the contrary, had the Indian policy been well worked out years back, we would have had our beams covering that market. Not too late. Even now, you have the African market just opening up. You have some of the Central Asian markets opening up. What India should be looking at is to monitor or monetize these orbital slots by giving it to the Indian industry to open up. It can manage the regulation, absolutely fine. Make sure the ownership of these companies are truly Indian. But then give the operator the freedom to operate, address newer markets, tap untapped markets. That's what I think I would want to state when you compare between China and India. China, absolutely inward looking, is no longer doing that. It is trying to play as a regional satellite operator. That's what the vision I think they are having.
So Govind, what is really happening with the broadcast sector in terms of the private players? Is there a lot of consolidation going on, and is there what exactly is happening there?
In any industry, consolidation will happen as we move forward. So broadcast industry is no different to that, especially when government issued the license for direct-to-home services sector, DTH. So 7 players, they took the license. Many international companies, 7 is too much. So they all did pretty well in the first few years. Then consolidation happened. We know that what's going on. So the consolidation do happen in the broadcasting industry, which is good sign. So that doesn't mean that the industry is doing well or not doing well. For various business considerations, things do happen in this fashion. So, it's a good thing. Consolidation is happening, and broadcast industry is also looking at newer technologies to be adopted in their services sector, so that they can cater to the needs of the people. Yeah.
So Ramesh, from all the reports that I've read in the media, there's always a CAG report, some other report that always talks about we have 75% of the transponders that we depend on foreign companies and things like that. Satellites are movable assets, and you can start providing services from anywhere to anywhere depending on where the demand comes from, right? So why haven't Indian private sector broadcasters, for example, bought or leased assets from others, or own satellites that others built to just provide services in India directly?
No, I mean this actually, in a way, the question contradicts itself in the sense that you say that 75% of the the broadcast or the satellite providers come from outside of India. And so that shows the fact that 75% of the capacity used by the Indian broadcasters is non-INSAT or non-ISRO, or whatever the terminology that is as such. That's because the market is growing rapidly. There's a lot of demand for this market, and then India by itself is not able to address that. On your point about how easy is it for satellite users to switch from one satellite to another, it's actually a little bit difficult. If you're a DTH operator, how do you tune 5-10 million antennas to start looking eastward to start looking westward? Very, very difficult. It's been done. One or two DTH operators in India have done through this exercise, but it's a very painful exercise. So once you stay on one particular satellite, there's a good intent for both the user and the provider that they stay connected for a very long time as such. So that is what has, despite the initiatives that the Indian government has taken, there is still the legacy advantage, or what you call the neighborhood advantage, that some of the satellites have. Now, any new broadcaster, he would want to be on the same satellite as the top television broadcasters are setting us. So that is a bit of a handicap, is that you don't really move from one satellite to another just like that. But there are large players who take a sizable amount of capacity. And your question is, why are they not owning these satellites? Is because the 20-30 minutes of conversation that we've been having so far is that the regulatory is a major roadblock. The second is the intent by the government is not very clear. The government is not extremely enthusiastic for this sector. So if these two change, I'm sure we would see multiple satellites having an Indian flag, but having different ownership within India or in years to come.
See, on the same thing, you mentioned about 75% of the total capacity used over India are serviced by foreign satellite operators. So it means those foreign satellite operators whom you mentioned obviously are allowed to be used over India. That means it's legal. So when we are talking about commercial satellite operations, the licenses are given by these ministries to private companies for what? For their commercial operations. So that means those private companies, they can take their business interest into account for running their commercial operations. So they will take the capacity or the equipment, whatever, that meets their requirement, both commercial and technological. So if there are two things, if 75% or large amount of capacity are serviced by foreign satellite operators, means either domestically we may not be able to meet the requirements of the industry, both in terms of availability of the capacity and probably the commercial price. But these two things drive. So once you are given a commercial license to operate, once you are allowed to use any satellite capacity that are allowed to be used over India, I think the commercial licensees should get the freedom to use what they want.
Yeah, so but the bottleneck there is of course the timeline, because I think the major, from all the reports and all the industry dialogue that is happening, the key question there is the limited period of leasing of the transponders that drive up the prices for the end users and change the market, because especially given that the policy in India is that the priority only goes to ISRO's capacity, and switching of the commercial players to ISRO's capacity, that drives up the prices of the end markets, because people are not able to negotiate better prices for leases, given that only 2 or 3 year agreements are made.
Again, there is nothing wrong a country protecting their interest, because the government's money goes into the deployment of the assets, that is satellites, and if the government has got capacity available with them to meet the requirements of the industry, I don't see any reason as to why government should not ask the industry to use the capacity that is available. Again, in this, since I mentioned that they're all commercial operators, their commercial interest has to be taken into consideration. Price is always is a relative thing. So you can price it based upon your cost plus something, or you price it based upon the market requirements. So price is a different thing. Even the foreign satellite operators also, they price for the same C-band or Ku-band capacity on different satellites differently. So that means, okay, it depends upon the requirements, though they price it differently. Whenever we talk about the commercial, obviously the licensees are definitely taking this commercial interest into account and use such capacity which meets their technical requirements and also the commercial requirement. As well as what you mentioned that, okay, government allows only short-term capacity, that is 3 years, things like that. That there only what I mentioned was people need to be little more flexible. If government has got a roadmap to show the private commercial operators, service providers, that they can provide the capacity within whatever the foreseeable time frame for next 10, 15 years, then commercial operators probably will agree to that. So if not, then commercial service providers, they ask the government to give them the freedom to sign 10-year contract instead of 3-year contract to drive their prices down. So they're only, what I mentioned is the government need to be more flexible looking at their deployment over a long period of time.
Sometimes it's actually sometimes the industry is happy with the 3-year contract because you don't know how the industry is changing. If you look at a typical life of a satellite, or especially the satellites that we are having in our discussion, is a 15-year lifetime, which means that if you look at, assuming that the 15th year is just about getting over now at 2020, we are talking about a satellite that got launched in 2005 and now serving all through the last 15 years. Between 2005 and now, so much has changed. The definition of broadband has changed. The type of broadcast requirement has changed. The type of modulation that we are using has changed. The type of services that we are providing has changed. So many a time, if you ask me as a broadcaster, or if you ask me as the owner of my company, do you want a long-term contract? Sometimes it may be in my own better interest not to have a long-term contract because I don't know how the business dynamics change. DTH, we had 7 DTH operators sitting in India, and right now we're probably boiling down to 2 or 3 DTH operators, and further consolidation may happen. We were talking about the time that Govind and I got seriously into the satellite business. The kind of bandwidth that was allowed by an internet operator or an ISP was you could take 4 meg by 1 meg. That was all. If the ISP wanted to take more than 4 meg, the government wouldn't have would not allow it. And now 4 meg by 1 meg is not even enough for your mobile. So things have changed. So it's very difficult to predict or to say, does the industry want a end of life contract, or does the industry want a 3-year contract, which makes it beneficially both for the broadcaster also. The broadcaster keeps the provider at tender hooks because he can always let the broadcast or let the satellite operator know that I could even move to another one. So it's all about business dynamics, and sometimes even a policy which is a little draconic in nature might help an enterprise.
No, what he's telling, correct, you're right. The freedom of choice is what service providers is asking, whether it is 3 year or 5 year or 10 year, it is for them to decide to drive down the price. Of course, they can always have an exit clause to come out of the contract. So the freedom of choice should not be dictated by the government. Freedom of choice should be exercised by the private service enterprises.
So one of the interesting bits here is I always wondered why you saw Reliance investing more in telecommunications rather than satellite is one field that a large conglomerate business in India could have invested very easily. Reliance having its own satellite or having enough number of satellites to provide capacity to the entire industry. The second option is you could have had an FDI, a foreign direct investment by a company that is abroad that could have had its own satellite built in India and launched out of this. So why haven't we seen both of these ideas mature?
Satellite actually not a money spinner. So most of the satellite operators are not doing profit. So it may look strange, but that's a fact. And the satellites also have got limited time frame to work. That means you have to generate revenue from the time you start launch and operating this satellite until the end of life. Then only you can make decent revenue, which is not the case because there are so many factors that come into effect while providing the satellite services. So as we again mentioned in the beginning, that satellite, it's not confined to India. Anywhere, it's a highly regulated segment to be operated. So large private houses whom you mentioned, they have got money to operate their own satellite, but they don't have that passion because their interest is to drive their commercial services. Satellite is one medium, so they, as long as somebody can meet that requirement to provide that medium, to provide the services, they are happy. They don't want to invest in that medium to meet their end requirement. So that's the reason they're not interested in spending their money to launch their own satellite and provide the services. So they're happy to outsource that capacity, whoever provides, whether it is ISRO or foreign satellite operator. Yeah.
Historically, satellites have been like airlines. They've always been state-owned. Every nation wants to have its own airline long back. So you had Nepal Airlines or Air India and all those things. Satellites have always been state-owned historically. So that is probably one reason that this is a sector that the private enterprise has not played any serious role. And of course, it's a different story back in the US. But otherwise, if you look at Europe or elsewhere, it has always been a state-owned phenomenon. And again, the fact that Govind said is that you have a 15-year life cycle to make the best out of what you have done, compared to you dig once and then lay a fiber, and then you have you actually don't lay a fiber, you lay a fiber conduit in which you can keep adding fiber as you want. And so that's a larger investment that is there. And why would a large business conglomerate go into a highly regulated market? And so I think it will only work if the government and the business enterprise work together. And even if you're talking about the China success story, it's the China success story from a Chinese government success story rather than whether Alibaba or somebody else has invested on it. Starlink, we talk a lot about Starlink today. That's probably an exception to the story, but we also don't know because probably Elon Musk has the muscle power to drive his thought through the Fed as well.
You have to have a passion, actually, if you want to run a satellite industry. If you want to, first of all, you have to have a passion. Then, obviously, the money. Then you need to be in that segment to operate the satellite. The commercial service providers whom you mentioned, who make with the satellite, their main interest is to provide the end services, not to operate the satellite which help them to provide these services.
Yeah, the other point I probably missed out. The other point is you can't make money on satellite by just addressing India market. Well, I don't know what business plans or what planning or what business modeling goes on when you look at the costing of an INSAT satellite, but there's been a lot of talks about that. But then by addressing an India market alone, you cannot make your money, make the 120, 130 million dollar that goes into an investment, or even more if it's a 4-ton, 5-ton satellite. You can't do that. You must have a bigger, wider footprint. You must address larger markets. You must have flexibility in your approach. You must be able to switch your beams to play along with the market forces which drive business. At 2020, business can be so very different from at 2030. So very, very difficult to anticipate the satellite business.
So we already talked about VSAT and broadcasting. The next logical industry, I guess that involved in satellite is internet, right? Broadband. And so how prepared are we for satellite broadband in India, and what is currently going on with satellite broadband?
See, when we talk about satellite broadband, obviously, high throughput satellite is the one what we are discussing. So ISRO also has been working on high throughput satellite. They have launched HTS satellite. They are also in discussions to provide 2 more satellites. I don't know where it is now today. And there are private industries, as Ramesh mentioned about Starlink, working on the constellation of LEO satellites to provide internet broadband. There's an Indian company also, startup Astrom Technologies, working on constellation of LEO satellites by designing a payload which give 100 Gbps per satellite internet bandwidth from space, and in that 200 constellations, about 20 terabyte internet data is made available. So there are so many such things are going on. Again, the operation of the satellite for providing this internet broadband data is one thing. Business consideration is another thing. Regulatory environment is another thing. Business consideration, of course, it's a private enterprises. They take the risk and they have their own business model to operate. And the technology guys, they develop the technology to provide such satellite to meet that requirement. And regulatory environment is another thing. What I feel is the country has to come out with a policy to suit the incumbent satellite operator if they can meet the requirement, or allow the private operator to give the regulatory concessions for them to operate their satellite out of the country. So these are the things, but as for the business is concerned, we don't know how it really takes shape. As I mentioned, it's for the private enterprises to decide. Time is the essence. The more we delay, the more the other applications will, or other technologies will enter into the fray. But there are a lot of developments that are going on in this high throughput satellite area. Large organizations are working on that. And it takes time.
Yeah, actually.
And Government of India also still have not come out policy to on the use of Ka band for operating this HTS satellite.
Yeah, I mean, taking off from what Govind was saying, I mean, we are actively working with Astro, who is actually coming out with a constellation of satellites to deliver high-speed broadband, large bandwidth across the thing. But sometimes, it's the curse of being ahead of the curve. Sometimes it's not always good to be ahead of the curve. Something you're cursed to be ahead of the curve. Is that what Astrom is doing is some brilliant work. But then the bands that Astrom plans to operate, the V and W band, Still, the government isn't even thinking on those lines. But then the government must start looking at it differently. This is a new band, it's a new enterprise, it's a new market. And all along we've been talking about what can the government do, how can Indian enterprise walk out of the, cut the cord with the mother ISRO or Department of Space, whatever you want to call it. It can only work if we start looking at hand-holding or nurturing capacity, nurturing technologies which are going to be the money crunchers or the real technology years to come. What Astrom is doing on the VNW band is some very interesting thing. Government should start thinking up and opening up. Maybe India should be the first country which should open up some very exciting bands, and everybody starts looking at it. But then I guess the ask is always much bigger than what can be delivered.
What is the relationship between, let's say, internet service provided by or capacity provided by ISRO? Because you talked about DOT licensing again. We talked about MIB, giving broadcasting license. So how plugged are internet service providers into capacity of internet provided by ISRO today, or how does that work?
Capacity provided by ISRO.
No, the internet.
The point is right now any form of internet is largely fiber. Correct. Okay. Point number one. Point number two is can you use VSAT for internet? Yes, you can use VSAT for internet, but then there are a lot of limitations on how do you use VSAT for internet. Not much of existing satellite capacity is used for internet per se, compared to what is being used for a closed user group or a VSAT kind of services. In India, we haven't really seen the surge of use of satellite for broadband or internet applications. That's again because one is the cost of the terminal is becoming very expensive. You need to put up a pointed 1 meter, 2 meter, 1.2 meter antenna, and then very, very complex regulatory when it comes to uplinking. You can have a receive RO antenna on your rooftop. You can watch all the television channels by your own in your home. But then there's no way that you can put up a VSAT terminal on your thing unless and until you get multiple licenses, multiple approvals, and hopefully not multiple times a year. So that is one reason why broadband per se is not becoming very popular for using satellite as a solution. At some point there was a consideration that let's deliver broadband to the curb and then allow a wired solution down to the home, but that didn't really pick up. And I don't think in today's environment we would have satellite playing a very, very key role in providing broadband, because there's I always believe that there's plenty of fiber around. There's plenty of fiber around. I've never heard any operator tell me that my fiber is full. I don't think that's ever going to happen. But that what would probably be there is that some remotes, their government, user fund, what is that? There's some of the mandated requirements by the government that you connect to the rural India. As that solution, maybe satellite may be used. Yeah.
So we talked about internet and telecommunications, and use of backhaul services is again a big market for India. How is the landscape of all of this emerging? Is this again a play where telecom operators are using foreign satellite capacity, or?
No, by and large, for backhaul services requirement, the domestic satellite requirement meets their need. So INSAT has got capacity to meet such requirement, both KU and C-band. So I think there's no concern in that area, because satellite again for delivery of internet services by various ISPs So they need backhaul services that I think by and large these people they make insert meets. So there is no concern in that aspect.
Yeah, that's true. That's correct.
Yeah, so because at the end of the day, I think what I'm not seeing is a holistic understanding of connectivity at large, because connectivity can be provided in many means. We talked about connectivity by fiber, connectivity by satellite, connectivity by so many other means, mobiles and so on. So I wonder if some countries have extremely connectivity as a core center of policy making, and then people come out on the top and the government says there are many arms working on many different ways of connectivity, and so there's a very strategic outlook to how connectivity is provided across the country, taking into account that the country needs to be connected, but how it does in different ways and different paths are different, because that can drive a lot of strategic decision making. Because often I think if you see connectivity as not the core, but you see only a satellite as one bit, fiber as one bit, somebody else as some other bit, then you become very myopic in your decision making.
Yeah, that's true. That's a very good thinking. Of course, things will happen based upon how you think. So no doubt about that. That's very complicated. So to have one body to look at only the connectivity needs and people who really need such connectivity for their provisioning of their services is an excellent thinking. But we need to also understand the complications involved in such things. But that's a good point. If somebody comes out with their requirement, then the others can at least brainstorm and see why and how it can be done or it cannot be done. But it's complicated. You cannot have one body to look at only the connectivity and see that all these bodies like satellite providers, fiber providers and other providers also fall into the right. But what is good point you have raised is, if there is a body who can say that country's connectivity requirements is so much, it's met by fiber so much, so much cannot be met by fiber, at least satellite providers, whether it is a domestic satellite operator or foreign satellite operators allowed by the government, should work on providing such requirements so that there is total connectivity requirement met by the combination of fiber and satellite. So that way we need to be, in fact Ramesh was mentioning about that the USO obligations, University Service Obligations. That means country require to provide connectivity in the rural areas. So that means you have to work on providing connectivity to the unconnected areas. Can you meet that by fiber? No, 100%. That means the balance at least should be met by the satellite operator. So the body which you were sort of mentioning should really work in a holistic manner to see what is the country's need for meeting the connectivity within the urban areas, within the country, within the rural area, and connecting urban and rural. All those things they need to consider, and what is needed by the country. I think a policy has to be evolved in that connection. But that's a good point to you.
Govind is saying the government requirement that you should do universal service obligation. Universal service obligation is obligation on the service provider to connect the rural villages into it. But is that economical? Is that meaningful? It's not. So if it is being done only because the regulation demands, it's being done because the government arm twists the provider, saying that you must also connect the smaller towns, so the farthest of the villages. So then it's not a commercially viable solution, and that's where satellite is in a way stuck around. It's servicing an area where there is no revenue potential from the USO, and it can only act as a backup to the existing services. But all said and done, they are complementing technologies. Not one technology can replace the other. We have seen in the Western world, and we see today also, that both coexist. There are market for each one of them, and satellite has always been innovating itself. Right from being a pure broadcast to broadband to IoT, all the time the satellite industry has always kept innovating itself to address the market.
So we talked about Elon Musk and Starlink and LEO constellations, and there's also several other startups like OneWeb and everybody trying to occupy the space of low Earth orbiting non-geostationary satellite space services. Do you think these companies kind of emerged like phoenixes, trying to provide new services based on new architecture, new technologies, and have left legacy, both industry legacy as well as legacy countries in a fix, because essentially now because of these people, they are going to start providing these global services, and it might risk all these investments that people have been making in the geostationary orbit. So, what do you think about because the question is very interesting, because I always think that it's very easy to say that ISRO might not have seen this coming. Right, it might not have seen an operator providing LEO-based capacity.
Correct. See, but very interesting. But then let's try going back a few years in history and start looking at the moment Iridium and Globalstar came up. We thought they're going to shake up the world. They're going to have mobile phones or satellite phones come, and you have virtual connectivity all over, right in the Himalayas to the middle of this Thar desert, you would have connectivity. But is that required? Or is that the way the world evolved? The market that was perceived by those companies which started Iridium and Globalstar was a market that just swung itself totally the other direction, and you had mobile connectivity everywhere. Iridium had to redefine itself. Almost Iridium had to burn their own satellites, but then only to come back in a new avatar as a data provider, not as a voice provider. So the answer to your question is, you don't know what technologies would evolve, whether OneWeb would do well or not. OneWeb is now quite a few years into business. We don't know how they are doing. Starlink seems to challenge the world, but then there is this famous saying, right? Object in the mirrors are closer than they appear in the screen, or than they appear. So not everybody I believe, is going to be successful. There are half a dozen LEO constellation broadband services, but you'll boil down to one or two eventually.
See, your thing is whether the new technologies are newer avatars, are they putting the legacy business in a fix? It may appear to be like that, but all are in business. So, if that's the case, then that's a business risk they are taking. But as we mentioned, everybody keep innovating themselves. So they have coming out with new technologies to bridge the gap, to meet the requirement, and in the process, the legacy systems probably may be left behind, and the entities who are still in the legacy business may be in a fix. That's the reason everybody needs to stand up to the challenges and keep transforming themselves to the new technologies that are emerging. As Ramesh mentioned, we don't know how the new technologies will emerge and be successful. But the good example of Iridium, for example, so even in Government of India also has got license called GMPCS, Global Mobile Personal Communication System. So that's how it came. But as they evolved, they realized and moved from voice communications to data. In fact, Iridium, they're doing pretty well because they have moved their business from what it was envisaged in the beginning to what it is today. That's how the companies have to evolve themselves and be innovative in everything. Coming back to this, I think our country also should be more innovative, keeping our legacy policy intact, taking the country's interest as the paramount interest. Keep innovating to meet the business entities, business enterprises requirement.
So right now I see a lot of countries, clearing services of these companies to be allowed in those countries. I think even recently I saw last week New Zealand,
Yes.
declaring rights for Starlink to operate on top of their geography. It is not easy for a country like India to make such a decision. It has not been easy in legacy-wise as well, because I think even Iridium services are heavily restricted to users, and not private people cannot use almost Iridium satellite phones or other kind of services. It's mostly through the government and mostly restricted to government-based services bodies as well. So, what do you think, or how do you predict the future of some of these companies? Because most of these companies, unless and until a company like Astrom succeeds and provides services, that may be more easier because they are an Indian entity. But if some of these entities want to provide connectivity over India, is that the system ready for it?
No, actually, any large country, any country which can actually move the needle on the market share or on the business, would never open up very quickly. Smaller countries like New Zealand, they might be driven by maybe by the company itself to open up. But a country like India, I don't think they need to open up that very quickly. They should be able to open up. India that way always had a policy saying that let's have the government enterprise start into the business and then move forward. We always had the first DTH service coming out from the government. We have the first mobile services come out from the government. So a large market like India would rather want to see two solution providers, two similar technologies come in rather than just open up for one. And as you rightly said, it depends on how much of awareness that the government has about technologies that have been grown within the country. How much of noise are the Indian entrepreneurs making, especially on similar areas, so that the government can make it a level playing field. We always start, as an Indian enterprise, you always start with a handicap, is that you don't have the ease or the easy access to the world market as somebody else would have from US or from a Western world. So your question to it, New Zealand has opened up, Papua New Guinea opened up. When would India open up? I would rather say India would open up probably in the second on the product life cycle. It would rather wait and have half a dozen operators come compete, or give a more favorable approach to an Indian enterprise coming up and then open the market.
Yeah, that's true. No, those countries what we mentioned, though important, are inconsequential, because each country has to take care of their country's interest in order. So China is different, India is different, Russia is different. So, and because we are all, I mentioned these countries, they are all space owned countries. They have got a lot of interest in the space. So they have to take their interest into consideration. I see the external service providers, whomever you mentioned, Starlink, OneWeb, they're all commercial entities. They want to provide services over India. Fine, that's well understood. And probably meet some of the requirements of the Indian enterprises. But I'm not telling that, okay, we should really come out with a policy to help the foreign service providers at the cost of our own requirement. No, I will not advocate that. But if there are any Indian entities coming, maybe we should be flexible enough to come out with an innovative ideas within the framework of the existing policy to help them. Obviously, foreign service providers would like to provide services over India because they have the business potential over India. If that can be met by Indian entity, why not? See, protectionism is not a bad thing, it's a good thing. But at the same time, exercise the flexibility without impacting the local. When I say local, it is again, ISRO is also considered local. Their interest has to be protected. The Indian companies which are emerging, their interest has to be protected. And the policy has to be respected and complied with. And they need to be more innovative, to be flexible enough to accommodate such techniques.
Yeah, because I think this is a very interesting discussion, because you can think of it in a different point of view when you think of it from an economic theory perspective.
Correct.
So because, from an economic theory perspective, you talk about countries' wealth and taxes. And of course, when you can say that this kind of connectivity provided by anyone for that matter, it creates tax wealth in the country, because ultimately these are people who are providing services in the country, and that creates jobs, it creates economic activity, and there's a whole lot of taxes being collected by the state because they are providing services then, right? So because ultimately satellite is just one layer of technology, it's a tool, and ultimately the state needs to get wealth out of that tool to benefit out of it. So to say that I will not allow something blocks the very bit of you being able to collect tax at the end. So because a lot of these drive decision making, and I think a lot of these get cluttered in decision making at the end.
Correct. In this connection, what you mentioned, connectivity, that's very important. In fact, when it's interesting, the GSM, the mobile phone came, it was actually conceived to provide voice connectivity when you are on the move. But very quickly, the technologists and guys who are innovative, they made use of that connectivity that was provided by somebody to drive many applications. Very quickly, the same GSM network, the phones, we consider that it can also be used for voice communication. So like that, once we provide connectivity by different means which you mentioned, in fact, we should also understand that it drives the technologies and that they can come out with more applications which provide more jobs, which provides more revenue for the country. Yeah, country can grow economically. That's true. I agree.
Yeah, because ultimately, imagine a future where, let's say, Starlink is providing services at the moment globally, not in India, right? So the country's policy to provide connectivity could be that any operator, be it foreign or local, in that sense, should have a local Indian entity that provides, that is the point of contact for India, for the Indian government. And it doesn't matter where they build those satellites or whatever it is, right? Ultimately, the local entity is the one that is providing the capacity and is legally bound to answer to the country. And you can even include offset clauses that countries include in defense contracts, for example, saying because we are opening up the certain market, 30% or 40% of the contract should be, or equipment must be manufactured in India, or there's a lot of innovative policy making somebody can do to make sure that certain knowledge gets imparted into the local ecosystem, and you're not missing out on the whole revolution at that point of time. And at the same time, the country is actually, getting the services and collecting taxes at the end.
That's probably that's probably stage 2 of the thought. That's probably stage.
Offset has come out in defense because the stakes are very high. The offset actually came out because of the quantum of the business involved. They wanted certain percentage, like 40% should go to the Indian companies to help Indian companies. Whereas in satellite, what we are discussing, the offset really doesn't work. So why we should think that there are restrictions in allowing foreign satellite providers to provide services over India is not only for economical reasons, not only because of protectionism, but also security requirements. These three are important only. So security we cannot compromise. That's the reason anything that is uplink over India has to land in India before it goes out. Anything is a well understood concept. So in the same way, so country has to consider the requirement from the security point of view, from the protectionism point of view. If local companies like ISRO or any private companies are working on similar kind of project, why not we give preference to them? When we say preference is given to them, that should not deter in not granting licenses to foreign satellite providers just because we have that policy. That's why I said that we need to be flexible, we need to be innovative to give protection to the local guys and also give access to the foreign satellite providers.
But most importantly, these are critical services. India has learnt painfully from the Kargil war experience, saying that your dependence on GPS as the only mode of getting locational information was let down. And that's the reason why you have Europe looking at an alternate thing. I don't know which way that's working, but that's beside the point. You have Russia having its own services. You have China having its own GPS equivalent, and India also developing one. So any service, you must have an Indian component to that service. You must have an Indian equivalent to that service. Because you're not a small nation, you're not a nation which is depending upon tourism, or you're not looking upon a nation as looking at your dairy products being picked up, but you're a nation that can stand on its own feet and probably deliver better services to smaller countries around you. So my answer to that would be, yeah, Starlink is welcome, but Starlink as well. We would rather have India Link and Starlink, and not just Starlink alone.
So how about the new landscape? Because we are coming to the end of the podcast, and so I want to talk a little bit about the future, because ultimately you're seeing 5G evolve. You're seeing a lot of new services coming up. We still have not seen so much of usage of internet connectivity on aircraft evolve in India. There's so many other of these technologies that are up and coming across the world, and how prepared do you think India is for all of this?
Actually, India, I don't know about 5G and all those services, but I can tell you that the generalized satellite market, a lot of things are happening around here. Lots of things are been. It's a market which is getting many people excited, especially the young folks are getting pretty excited about this. And I'm seeing the convergence of technology. I'm seeing artificial intelligence, data analytics, overlay satellite imagery, and I think if the guys play their cards well, they get good support both by the industry and by the government, I think we might have some exclusive products coming out using SATCOM, not directly, but SATCOM data analytics from India very soon.
So I think what's more important is we need to really apply what I call as walk the talk. So that means whatever we talk, ease of doing business, help the local entrepreneurs, help the local startups, all these things should make it happen very quickly. In fact, the technologies, they are moving very fast. Business will not wait for us to take some decisions. That's very important. Walk the talk is very important. As I mentioned that, taking all three into considerations, the country's interest, the domestic operators' interest, things like that. So that's very important. And very interesting in this, we know that there is a demand for satellite capacity, even though things are happening. For example, fiber is really excellent for point-to-point communications. Satellite is excellent for multi-point, point-to-multipoint, multicasting, broadcasting kind of application. Again, within that, we are telling Geo to Leo and Leo constellation things. So things are all evolving. To meet what? The broadband requirement of the country. So that means we have been talking for the last 20 years, so everybody is bandwidth hungry. We need bandwidth, more bandwidth kind of thing. That's the reason. At the same time, how things are evolving, maybe within the next 15 to 20 years, this kind of broadband may not be required also. Because of the artificial intelligence machine coming to picture, that they need machines. They need only small bandwidth. So we need large bandwidths to download the data. So if the machines play a major role, you don't need such bandwidth maybe in 15 to 20 years time, because they need only a small bandwidth. Instead of a large pipe, we say thin pipe. And it meets most of the requirements of what we are doing, because it keeps changing. That's the reason what I said is we need to walk the talk. That means we need to make quick decisions to go along with the changing trends.
Perfect, that's correct. I mean, the point that, a viewpoint that we carry within an era is that we might actually, the requirement might just flip over. It's that there could be the human population using bandwidth in plenty to watch useless content. Whereas the actual content that needs to be driven is going to be communication between two robots or two artificial intelligence processors. And they don't need much bandwidth. They just need a thin pipe to drive along. So a thought line that is going within an era is that maybe there might be a constellation of satellites which are providing thin pipes, and the fat pipes are left for useless data for man to entertain himself.
So you have been supporting a lot of young people doing new things in India, and given that you have seen a lot of the industry evolve, I think your insights are very useful. What would be your encouragement or areas that you think that people should work on, young people in India should work on in the upcoming years, on different technology or service areas, or different things that would make this sector more exciting? Because Astrom is only one such company that is trying to do some things, but for a country of the size of India, you need 100 Astroms. 100
Astroms. You're right. In fact, 100 Astroms are already coming up in India, which is very good. Though we spoke about the regulation, things like that in the country, still there are hopes because of large number of startups in space industry and space sector coming up. To answer your specific question, what is your advice to youngsters is, in fact, they should work more on applications. Only very few will work on infrastructure. As you mentioned, that to provide connectivity, whatever may be that, doesn't matter. Youngsters should really work on applications. As we have been seeing, a lot of new applications are emerging because of the data analytics which Ramesh mentioned. So you can capture something using satellite imagery, but you need to really use that to provide many such applications are there. The youngsters really should work on innovative things. They are working on small satellites and many applications using such things. So in fact, there is everything keep changing, keep transforming. As we say, the change is constant. So that's happening. So how quickly we adapt ourselves to that to meet the requirements what we know today, or what we envisage going forward, is on which the youngsters should work on.
Correct. I mean, just to add to what Govind said, is that maybe one word of advice that I might want to give, given the grey hair that I have, is that don't look at India alone as a market. And most of these young guys want to address India. The podcast, which has gone for over 45 minutes, 1 hour, talks about challenges that an Indian business operator faces. So there's a market outside of India, and well demonstrated by the IT sector is that we've done well despite the government. And similarly, we have done well not addressing the Indian market. I would advise all these smart geeks sitting out there and tweaking their models to work. Look beyond India. Look, there's a bigger market out there, and that's an easier market to address. Maybe they should look at it that way and look at India as a second market to come and see. That is probably one advice that I would want to give.
So we've recorded 2 hours of a conversation. This is the longest episode of the NewSpace India podcast so far. I thank both of you deeply for sharing your time, which is the most biggest asset for you both. Thank you very much for coming on the show, and I hope to record a future episode, maybe several years down the line, to see how this conversation is reflecting on the future of several of these companies like Astrom shaping up, and how things will evolve in India. I hope there's a bright future for all.
Yeah, surely. Exciting times ahead.
That's true. Wonderful NP. In fact, should really appreciate the efforts you have been taking. I know you for the last few years. So your perseverance and the efforts to change is really appreciated.
Thank you for staying until the end. If you have any comments or suggestions, please write to curator@newspaceindia.com. Please consider sharing this episode with any friends or family who may be interested in learning about India's space activities. If you would like to stay in touch with the NewSpace India community, please use the link in the description to join the NewSpace India Telegram group. Feel free to also suggest guests for any future episodes. A new episode of the NewSpace India podcast is released every other Friday. Do subscribe to the podcast using Apple, Google, or any other podcasting platforms you may use. Until the next episode, thank you.